So in this final video, with a brief introduction of virtual teamwork, I'll go over some things that we know from research about how leaders and team members can enhance the performance and effectiveness of virtual teams. So, I think lesson number one is that more so than ever, leaders have to be proactive. I think this would even start before what I have on this slide, which is those questions of forming a team and staffing a team. The composition questions are really, really important here, even more than what we think about in face-to-face teams, because we have to think about, do you have the capability to form a team with some personal connection where people have had an opportunity to meet before, have had some familiarity or previous work experience together, and what the social capital and network connections those people have, both with the team members, but in outside. You want to think about people who, if we think about boundary spanning, if you're thinking about a person sitting in a different geographic location, you'd prefer a team member who has strong network ties to important parties in their location, because they're going to help the team more than someone without those kinds of social network ties. So to the extent that you have some, capacity to choose and to look at some of those things, composing your team should take those into consideration. And then it's really important to just understand more about the situation the people on your team are working in. The very best practice for this in terms of research is to try to have meetings in all the different locations. Understandably right now, nobody can go anywhere. But even under the best circumstances, without the crisis we're facing now, it's often too costly, and organizations will not invest the money to fly team members to different locations. But that's really a tragedy in a lot of ways, because oftentimes you don't know what's available through your team members at a particular location. I've studied teams where they've worked globally and they didn't recognize that in one location in Asia, they didn't know that that subsidiary had a certain kind of chemical testing capability. And so they didn't really uncover an opportunity they had through their team to access more capacity because they didn't understand that context feature. So even if you can't travel, having some part of the planning, the launch part of the team, have people kind of maybe give a virtual tour or give a little bit of a background about like what they have available, what's going on there, what are the particular challenges in their location, what are some types of expertise that's there that you might not know about because you've never been able to visit that subsidiary or location before. So those kinds of things can help build some of the contextual knowledge that can help the team understand what kind of resources it can access through its different members. It's important to try to highlight what information is really important on a project. This again goes back to clarifying goals and clarifying purposes. Some of the basic things we would do for any team would need to be done here, but we shouldn't assume, and I think sometimes in face-to-face teams we can get away with it because we can see when people aren't really understanding why we're asking a particular question and we can follow up. But in a virtual team situation, it may take us days or weeks or worse to recognize that there's been some misunderstanding brewing, and at which time we've lost valuable time or we've made a mistake or an error that we could have prevented. So speed and timing are open to interpretation. This is a link for sure to cultural differences. We do know that there are wide differences in the idea of time orientation and scheduling, and what constitutes a fast response, whether a fast response is actually a good thing or a bad thing. In the German context, speed might indicate recklessness, and taking longer might indicate careful analysis. And on the other side of that, you might become frustrated if you feel like someone's dragging their feet and not getting something done on time. So all of these things come into play, and if there are cultural differences present, they're just going to be enhanced and harder to detect when you're working with a technology-mediated team. So, altogether, it means we just have to be more explicit. We have to be simpler in our communications. We should clarify expectations. Don't use kind of idioms or acronyms. Don't just say as fast as you possibly can or as soon as possible. Um, Spelling things out much more clearly. And frankly, following up, being much better about documenting interactions. Frankly, this is kind of interesting with all the Zoom experiences we had. The idea of when and under what circumstances should a team meeting be recorded and available to the team, because I could see some really good and positive things where, especially if we have people on the team from different cultural or language backgrounds, the opportunity to review something and sort of slow things down and process it might be really, really helpful. So maybe one thing you could think a little bit about, or we could talk a bit about in our interactive time tomorrow, is to what extent is that used, and are you recording things, and how acceptable is that? I would imagine that there are some concerns over intellectual property and other things from recording in Zoom meetings, but it's just an interesting thing to think a little bit about how it could be helpful for people to be able to review verbal video interactions in virtual teams. Um, Role clarity, right? Accountability, using tools like RACI, using tools where there's clear agendas and assignments after the team meeting is even more important when people sort of disappear into their own location and don't see each other and don't feel a sense of connection except when they're having a synchronous meeting. So, we've already talked about staffing for effectiveness, and I also mentioned, if it's at all possible, to travel to different locations and hold meetings on a rotation basis in different locations. Those are really effective ways to understand the context. But even more than that, if it's not financially feasible to do that, or in this time right now, we can't think about face-to-face kickoff. But if it's possible to have a face-to-face kickoff, particularly if a team is going to be a fairly permanent formal team for quite a while, that can establish some of that basic early trust and connection on a relationship level that is really, really vital. And making time for contact that is personal is also really important. Taking some time to just check in and learn some things about each other, learn some common interests that you might have, and intentionally block some time in a meeting for that sort of personal check-in so that people establish the relationship connections, because we know that that enhances teamwork and team performance, but it's less likely to occur in virtual teams and when people are using technology mediation. People tend to just get task focused, feel like that meeting needs to get down to business. We don't want to be on this call for very long. And we lose the opportunity to enhance the personal connections and relational capital available to the team. It's also important to figure out some ways to stay in touch outside of team meetings, to maintain connections of some sort, checking in on how things are doing. This is where project management is important. This is where some of those tools I mentioned in the multiple team membership video, Trello, Slack, there's a lot of these collaboration tools. If you have those present, kind of finding ways for people to just check in and manage the process and have opportunities to know what expectations and deliverables are can keep people feeling connected to the team even when they're not having meetings. People who connect often are more engaged, and you shouldn't wait till there's a deadline or deliverable, because you will not have established some of those important interpersonal connections and psychological states that are necessary to perform effectively. So, a big issue in all teams is trust. And when we have technology, we can sometimes have this challenge. And so we want to make sure we establish communication norms, that we respect the experiences of all the people. And I think one thing is, the idea of equal suffering. If you have a global team, one way to really make people feel pretty mistreated is to always expect people from one part of the world to take their family time to be on work calls or have to lose sleep to be on work calls. So the idea of sharing the suffering is important, to make sure that you rotate who's got the challenging times for work. Again, that can create that sense of care and empathy inside the team that can help prevent those attribution problems if something's going wrong or if something is misunderstood. Another thing to think a little bit about is the work cycle and meetings, and managing asynchronous and synchronous meetings. Um, Again, on synchronous meetings, having time for social check-ins and relationships is good. Every meeting, stop every now and then and sort of see, are we all still here? We lost anybody? Do we need to repeat something? Because as we know, it's also extremely easy to be distracted when we're working in this environment that's a virtual environment. So, I think accepting that people will be, and not being angry if people have some distractions or get distracted or lose track, but bringing them back in and checking. And every end of the meeting here is where it's even more vital to have some kind of report out, concrete plan, meeting minutes, or use tools like Trello and assign things in projects so that people are clear about their roles and that we don't have failures just because we didn't communicate and capture what needs to happen as a result of the meeting. It's also important to know that not all technology mediation is bad. There's actually been some comparison lab studies of teams working face-to-face versus on video conference. And what has been found is that technologies that are leaner, right, less information, so maybe just voice or text-based communication, that transition from task conflict to relationship conflict doesn't happen as much. So again, sometimes we can actually have a little less conflict in teams that are technology mediated, and maybe be able to have those kinds of good task discourse that can help the team perform better. A couple final points here. We want to think about, we always want to be effective at planning in teams, but this is even more important when we have virtual work. And these three graphs are from a paper published by Mesnevsky and Chudoba, where they looked at a set of global virtual teams, and they looked at sort of how intense their interactions were. And the peaks in this graph are where there's higher level of interaction going on in the team, and the valleys are lower levels. So you see these rhythms of interaction. And on the y-axis over here is the interaction intensity over time. So time is on this x-axis over here. So what they found, though, in terms of they could look at these teams, and they classified teams as effective or ineffective. And what they found was the effective teams kept a simple rhythm, right? So in this case, they had regularly planned intense interactions. So those might be, video conferences, for example, and then just sort of a consistent level of interaction between those. And these were planned, and they had nothing to do with problems facing the team. The team just set this rhythm up and stuck to it, had those more intense interactions on regular pulsed intervals. The other group of teams that they found effective, they had a dual rhythm. So they had some extreme contact and intensity at measured intervals, but then they also had some, sort of shorter ways to do this. And, a couple ways you could think about this happening is these could be a face-to-face meeting. This might be, quarterly or semi-annually or annually, the team comes together and has a major personal in-person interaction event. And maybe these are, regular weekly communications with email check-ins or using some other kind of collaboration software. And then maybe these are, every other week they're having, or every month they're having a Zoom meeting. So there's actually a video conference connected. What they found was that the teams that performed the worst were kind of random, and they were ad hoc. And what they found is what these teams did is the only time they scheduled an intense kind of communication, whether that's a face-to-face interaction or video conferencing, was when there was a problem. So these teams would just work until something was a conflict or a problem, then they'd come together with an intense interaction. And what they found is then those were very contentious and they were in a way wasted because they were just all about the problems that the team was facing, which tended to then, spill over and continue on when they had their lower levels of interaction. And these teams just never performed as well. So the takeaway from this is part of the planning in team design and team launch for teams that have to be virtual or hybrid should be a very intentional rhythm of interaction. And it should be spaced and not be problem focused. It should be part of a plan for running and managing the team process over time. And then one final thing that's a very important and effective thing to think about how to bring virtual teams together. And this actually is similar for culturally different teams or teams with maybe language differences as well, is to make sure that there are boundary objects. And Paul Carlisle is the research scholar who came up with this idea of a boundary object, but it's a shared physical object or virtual object that people can coalesce around and the team can understand together. So I put a picture of a blueprint here. Blueprints would be a boundary object because the team can circulate that, and it's actually a physical or electronic manifestation of the team's work. And the team can all look at it and make sense of what each other's talking about. Blueprint might be particularly important for some kinds of technical work. People are architects or builders or engineers, but there may be other kinds of boundary objects that can be shared in a team. The point is some kind of visualization, some kind of connectivity the team can have. And this is also true just thinking about having your virtual meetings. The share screen option is very powerful. Things that we've tried to do in class, having people be able to concurrently annotate a PowerPoint slide or opening up a Drive spreadsheet. It's very interesting to see how people, when they are working on something together and there's a joint product being produced and it can be visualized in front of them, how much that engages people in the virtual environment. So there's ways that this can help elevate the shared mental models, common understandings that people have of what's going on, and also keep their attention focused and their engagement high when in the virtual environment. And I think the final things I'll say is, we know issues of team size. And so having very large Zoom meetings with, more than 5 or 6 people, it shouldn't come as any surprise that if when a face-to-face team having more than 5 or 6 people starts to generate problems of participation. We know that at 6 or so, there's a small set of people who command 60+% of the communication airtime. The same kinds of problems are going to happen in virtual team meetings as well. So there may be times when there's a large blast of communication that needs to happen to a large number of people. But again, it's where combining things like X teams with flexible tiers and having subgroups working on subparts of projects that have a coordinating team or coordinating core team that's managing. And members of that coordinating core team could be present in subgroup virtual meetings, for example. All of the things that we've already talked about in class can come to play here. And we have to think about taking everything about making an effective team in a face-to-face environment and applying it here and being more vigilant about it, because the challenges faced in the virtual environment with the lack of other sort of social presence to keep people engaged make it harder to do this kind of work. But hopefully these are some suggestions you can think about that help you think about not only virtual teamwork, but some of just the virtual work that we're all having to do right now. Having a way to think about, can we enhance connectivity between ourselves and our coworkers and our teammates in this coronavirus time, making sure we're having personalized connections, making sure we're thinking about, shared screens and boundary objects and other places to connect with each other. I think these are all best practices that can help us a great deal right now. And we can think about learning what's working well here to make all of our virtual teamwork more effective in the future.